Journey of Eadric, written by Andrew Kenway. Chapter 1. The sounds of shouting echoed in Eadric's ears as he stirred. When he regained consciousness, the sounds got louder. He opened his eyes, but all he could see was a haze of white. Slowly, his vision returned, the hue of the sky filling his sight. He rolled over to his side, his chainmail clanging as he pushed himself up into a sitting position. His head throbbed, and there was dried blood crusting around his nose. As his senses came back, he soon realized that he was in the middle of the field. He turned his head and saw that his horse lay dead. Nearly a dozen arrows had struck it down. He looked down to see an arrow had pierced his chest plate. He reached out and snapped the shaft, feeling the head of the arrow fall through into his lap. "Move forward!" a voice called out. Eadric struggled to right himself, but he did just as more troops pressed towards him. Strutton archers marched in a tight formation. They got within 10 feet and began firing volleys high into the air. He watched as the arrows flew overhead, raining down on the foot soldiers that were fighting a good distance away. He stumbled over to his helmet, picked it up, and put it on his head before grabbing a spare sword off his dead horse. He raced forward towards the archers, ready to strike down as many as he could before he was overwhelmed. "For the king!" Eadric shouted. Eadric held his sword high as he pushed into the archers. The first archer to face him was cut down instantly as the sword met his soft leather armor. He cut down 2 more before they realized what was going on. "Penland soldier!" an archer cried. Many of the archers turned and fled back towards the hill, shouting for help from the small bands of foot soldiers and hoplites that were protecting their king and more archers. The archers that were carrying swords pulled them from their scabbards. Eadric soon found his way into the archers, who were now ready for a fight. Swords clanged against one another as he tried to fight off a large handful of men by himself. Something about this fight felt different to him. No matter how the soldiers moved, it was almost as if he knew which ones would attack and when, allowing him to counter them all. It wasn't long before a dozen men had fallen at his sword. "Archers, retreat!" a voice shouted. The last of the archers raced for safety, many leaving their bows where they lay. Sensing his chance, Eadric began the retreat away from the approaching soldiers before he would have to fight them again. There were at least a dozen men with swords and shields chasing him down. He knew that he would not fare as well as he did against the less seasoned archers. He didn't bother trying to look back as he retreated to the main area of battle. The men probably wouldn't chase him now that he was away from their archers and back in the heat of battle. "For the king!" Eadric shouted once again as he waded into the fight. As dusk approached, the fighting had ceased. Scores of men lay dead while the wounded were carted away. Eadric returned to his camp with the rest of the men, far from the field of battle. He found comfort around a large fire that had been built. A small group of soldiers sat on logs that surrounded the fire. "Eadric, how on earth are you still alive after all that?" Nerman asked. "Eurus must have seen fit to keep me safe. I should say an extra prayer. I only hit my head when my horse was killed," Eadric joked. "I saw you felled by an arrow just before your horse went down. You were dead." Eadric looked at Nerman for several seconds. He thought that his friend was joking, but the other men all seemed to share his sentiment. He smiled and looked around for any support, but he was looked at with confusion. "Well, you must believe that your eyes have deceived you, as I am sitting here before you now. Yes, the arrow did strike me, but it merely pierced my armor. It never got past the chainmail underneath. I was knocked off balance by the strike, and my horse going down caused me to hit my head off the ground, rendering me unconscious for a while." Eadric looked around, but no one seemed to believe his story. He looked around for support, but the people had all seen him fall. He stood up and lifted his tunic to show that the arrow had never pierced his flesh. He turned so that they could see his back as well. They looked at one another and nodded their affirmations that he was indeed telling the truth. "I am sorry that I didn't believe you, but you looked like you had fallen when the arrow struck you," Nerman said. "It's fine, my friend. The Creator has seen fit to keep me safe during this battle." The men sat around the fire and spoke for a few minutes when one of the king's knights walked over to the men and smiled at them. "Gentlemen, it has been a glorious day. I am glad to see that you are all in high spirits," Sir Raylan said. "Sir Raylan, it is a pleasure to see you as well. What news do you bring us?" Eadric replied. "Losses were high on both sides, but it seems like we have come out the victor. The Strutton king wants to negotiate peace with us tomorrow." The men cheered excitedly at this news. They had been fighting for almost a week now. If the talks were successful, then there was a chance that they would be home in 2 days' time. The men clanked their glasses together and toasted one another. "That is fantastic news," Frederick exclaimed. "Yes, but we must still negotiate the terms. We can only hope that the Struttons are men of honor and uphold their end of the peace talks." Then we shall all say a prayer before bed to ensure the peace." Sir Raylan nodded his thanks to the men before tapping Eadric on the shoulder. "I was wondering if I could have a moment with you." Eadric looked surprised by the question, but nodded his head. He knew better than to deny a request from one of the king's most trusted knights. He stood up and followed him away from the fire, out of earshot from the others. "What can I do for you, Sir Raylan?" "Eadric, the king was impressed by your determination. You waded into a sea of archers and fought valiantly, even returning to the main battle and fighting on. The king wants to recognize you for your bravery. Would you accompany us tomorrow when we meet to negotiate the treaty?" Eadric was speechless. The king had requested him to accompany him to the meeting. He stood silently, his mouth agape, only managing a small nod. He was a skilled soldier, but nothing special. He was not sure if he should even be stationed with the king's knights that usually stood by the king. "Are you sure that I should accompany you on such an important mission? I would think that a soldier such as myself would be better left on the front lines in case peace is not attained," Eadric blurted out. Sir Raylan smiled happily, patting him on the shoulder. "You have done a great service to the kingdom this day. Your recovery from your fall off the horse, managing to push back the archer battalion by yourself, proves that the king was right about you. You are what most knights strive to be. Some could mistake you for a paladin. You deserve the honors that are coming to you. Do not tell yourself otherwise." Sir Raylan bid Eadric farewell so that he could return to his station, leaving Eadric to stand by himself for a few minutes. He had still not processed the fact that he would be accompanying the king to negotiate peace with the Struttons. He walked back, past the fire, and pulled the flap to his small tent. He found his mat and laid down, his mind still picturing the events that would take place tomorrow. Eadric was nervous as he rode with King Braden and his men to neutral ground. Everything in him was telling him to be weary. He stayed close to the team, not wanting to fall too far behind. "I can tell that you have trepidation about joining us for this treaty, but I assure you that there is nothing to worry about, Eadric. King Latimer is an honorable man. It was he who called this meeting. I believe he has also grown weary of this fighting," King Braden assured him. "I am more concerned if I should be amongst such an important conference. I am a foot soldier and nothing more. My skill in combat was more a result of Eurus' grace and my desire to fight for you, my king." King Braden chuckled and waved his hand. "You are quite a modest man. I saw you fighting out there against the battalion of archers. You are skilled with a sword, and that is for certain. Your courage and dedication to the cause is commendable, and I wish to reward you for your loyalty. You deserve this honor. It was your repulsion of the archers that helped to turn the tide and finally bring King Latimer and myself to the table. How would I have done such a thing, my king? I merely held them back to give our men some time to regroup from the main fight." King Braden was about to respond, but the sound of other horses approaching drew all their attention. King Latimer came trotting up the path with 2 men on horseback and at least 5 foot soldiers following behind him, their chainmail rustling as they kept pace. Eadric watched his king slow to a halt, making the Struttons have to approach him. "King Latimer, I am honored that you could join us today to discuss peace. I am sure that you are just as weary of this fighting as I am," King Braden commented. "King Braden, the honor is assuredly mine. I hope that we can come together and build a lasting peace. This fight has changed my mind and made me realize that there are more important things that men of our status should be focused on." The 2 kings took point and rode slowly up the path, everyone giving them space but staying within a few lengths in case something were to happen. Eadric watched the men talk to one another. He tried to listen to the conversation, but they were just out of earshot from him. He wondered what they were discussing, but it was easy to assume that they were discussing the length of the war and the casualties on both sides. Eadric hadn't noticed that one of the Strutton men on horseback was staring at him intently. "You look familiar. Were you the madman who played dead before wading into our archers and dispatching a handful of them?" Sir Dietmar asked angrily. Eadric nervously looked at the man. He didn't want to outright admit that he was the man who had slaughtered his brothers, but he was afraid that lying would only make things worse and possibly aggravate him more. He didn't feel good about what had happened the prior day. He had lost friends as well. "I had been knocked unconscious when my horse was killed. I regained my senses as the archers approached. I was trying to protect my friends from the incoming volleys that they were firing. I took no joy in the lives I took. I lost many friends in this war that I will never speak with again. I hope that this meeting can bring us a lasting peace." Sir Dietmar continued to eye Eadric as he fell back and joined the other knight that King Latimer had brought with him. The lack of a response did not ease his mind anymore. He looked over at Sir Raylan, who was riding alongside 2 other knights that he had never met but had always seen with King Braden. He looked over at Eadric and nodded his head approvingly. Eadric went back to watching his king and trying to catch any bits of the conversation that he could. After an hour of riding through the countryside and discussing a variety of topics, the 2 kings came to a tentative agreement. They discussed general terms and set a date for when they would meet to sign an official declaration of peace between the two kingdoms. Eadric was relieved when they were away from the Strunton soldiers. Sir Dietmar had never stopped watching him the entirety of the meeting. He wondered if he thought him some sort of wizard or shapeshifter that would attack everyone if guards were lowered. When they got back to their camp, King Braden informed the men that they would be returning home to their families. The men responded with a resounding cheer. Many of them had been fighting for months. Let it be said that on this day, the Panlean kingdom prevailed. It is because of your dedication and courage that we have defended our land and gained new land in the process. We shall mourn those we lost and remember them as warriors who helped preserve our way of life, King Braden said proudly. The men celebrated and began to break down the camp, everyone wanting to return home as quickly as possible. Eadric wasn't as eager to return as his companions. They had families to see, while his had died a long time ago. Eadric had friends that he could visit and speak with, but his family was gone. He had no loved ones to miss him or greet him as he returned home, triumphant. Eadric, you held your nerve out there today. It was obvious to both Sir Guilford and I that Sir Dietmar was not fond of you in the slightest. I am sure that he was not excited about the accord, as it was an embarrassment for them to surrender to us, Sir Raylan said as he walked over to Eadric. I understand his frustrations. He lost people he cared about. I am sure that he has not forgiven me. It just felt to me as if he believed that I might attack them and ruin the truce that the kings were building towards. Everyone was tense, including myself. There was no telling if the negotiations would break down, and it would lead to another fight. It was not wrong to be conscious of possible dangers that might face us. There is nothing wrong with taking precautions. It is the job of the knight to think of all possibilities when entering a fight. I am not a knight. I am merely a foot soldier who was given a chance to run with the cavalry because of my proficiency on a horse. You have what it takes to be a knight of the order. Do not set your sights so short. Any other man in your situation would have played dead or fled the moment he saw the archers progressing, but you pushed forward for the king and country. You are exactly what knights are made of. Eadric continued to pack up supplies, while Sir Raylan made his rounds to check on the other men. Eadric was hard at work, loading up the wagons, when he heard the sound of someone whispering his name. He looked up and turned around, but no one was within earshot of him. He walked around the cart, trying to find the source of the voice. The voice slowly faded into the wind and left him with questions. The voice was almost angelic, and obviously female in nature. His body shook as he thought and clutched his chest right in the spot where the arrow had pierced his armor. You didn't hear a thing. It was just the wind playing tricks on your mind. You have not slept well in several nights. When you get home, things will go back to normal and you will rest easy. The visions and the sounds will pass, Eadric assured himself. The sounds of trumpets blared triumphantly when the Panlean army returned home to the kingdom. Crowds gathered along the main road to the castle as the army marched through the gates, King Braden and his knights leading the way. Eadric was on horseback, riding just behind the knights. Men, women, and children waved at him and cheered their thanks as he passed. He waved sheepishly at them and smiled. He heaved a sigh of relief now that he was home. It took the army several days of marching to return home, and he had found himself having dreams that he could not explain, but they still haunted the deepest recesses of his mind. The army marched forward and towards the castle before the soldiers were dismissed so that they could return to their families. Eadric turned his horse and made his way towards the stables so that the stable boy could take care of it for him. Eadric, if you would join us, King Braden said quickly. Eadric turned his head and saw that the king, Sir Guilford, and Sir Raylan were all riding towards him. I would be honored, your king, but I do not want to keep you all from attending to your families. Nonsense. As your king, it is your obligation to join me for a drink. Eadric nodded, knowing better than to refuse the request of a king. All of the men rode towards the stables to return their horses before walking towards the castle to have a few drinks. Eadric had never been inside the castle before, and he was amazed by its size. He followed the king into his dining room and was greeted by several servants who began attending to all of them. They pulled out their chairs and filled their glasses with wine. This is quite a reception, Eadric quipped as he held up the silver goblet. King Braden nodded approvingly. Being king does have its advantages. Sir Raylan raised his glass to his lips and took a sip of wine. Eadric was apprehensive at first, but followed suit and took a sip as well. The men drank their wine silently for several long seconds. I brought you here because I wanted to talk to you about your courageous fight against those archers. The king is right. Your skills were astounding. You fought off a dozen men by yourself, forcing them to retreat and move more capable fighters in, Sir Raylan informed him. To be honest, I do not know what came over me. When I regained consciousness from the fall, all I could think about was defending the kingdom. It just came to me. When the time came to fight for king and country, I found the will. Sir Raylan lifted his goblet. And that is what separates a true warrior from those who merely claim the warrior life. I wouldn't consider myself a warrior. I have never really known the warrior life. My father and mother were both merchants, so I never really knew how to wield a sword until later in life when I lost them both and was forced to learn how to protect myself. You did more than just protect yourself. You helped turn a tide of war. Had you not intervened when you did, we might have lost the fight, King Braden remarked. Eadric feigned a smile. He didn't feel like he did much. He held off a handful of archers, many of whom had little to no experience with the sword. The truth was he merely scared them off, and when the actual foot soldiers engaged him, he ran. He sipped his drink and nodded, not wanting to say anything. When King Braden met with King Latimer, he mentioned how one of our men forced their archers to retreat. That really shook them. They said you had risen from the dead with an arrow in your chest. One man caused them to think about negotiations. You are to be thanked for your service, Sir Guilford added. I did what any other soldier would have done for king and country. But it was you who forced them back. Because of your bravery, I have decided that I wish to knight you, King Braden boasted. Your king, you bestow upon me a great honor. Nonsense. Men like you are what keeps this kingdom strong. Men and boys wish to emulate your courage, and women wish to take your hand. I want you to become a part of my knight's order and ensure that our kingdom stays strong for years to come. Eadric dropped his goblet. It hit the table with a large clang, spilling its contents. It didn't feel real. The king was adamant about making him a knight. He had figured that he had been given gold and a meaningless title, but now he was going to become a knight, a position far above what he had ever imagined himself taking. Servants ran over and cleaned the mess, righting his glass and refilling it. I am honored, my king. I do not know what to say. Your kindness knows no limits. Then I will take your answer as an acceptance of my gift. You will need to start training with Sir Raylan to become a proper knight, but once you pass the test, we shall have a big ceremony to celebrate you. This was part 1 of The Journey of Eadric, written by Andrew Kenway. Hey, it's Andrew Kenway here. If you like this story, please consider to give a like and a subscribe to my channel for more content in The Journey of Eadric and other stories just like this. Thanks.